All right. So, hi, my name's Josh Wulf. I'm from New Zealand. I'm 46 years old, and I was raised in a Christian family, and I've studied the Bible and Christian apologetics. I did Western philosophy and linguistics at the University of Auckland, and I was initiated into the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya of Vedanta, which is popularly known as the Hare Krishnas, in 2002, and I've been studying and practicing that for over 20 years now. So I work professionally in software engineering, and I keep up to date with scientific developments and thinking by reading journals and papers. And I've had a peer-reviewed paper published, and I presented it at an international conference. And that was about computational reasoning over semantic representations of knowledge domains, which is quite a mouthful. But it's kind of like artificial intelligence. So to our topic of discussion today, is the mind material? So in any philosophic inquiry from both the Vedic and the Western perspective, we have to start with epistemology, which is like, before we can discuss what we know, we have to look at how we know anything, or valid ways of knowing. So according to the Vedic perspective, we have pratyaksha, which is direct sense perception. That's what we would call empirical observation in Western science. And then we have anuman, which is what we'd call deduction, logical reasoning, inference. And this is kind of where we run into the first challenge in this examination, and that is that what we're trying to examine here is fundamentally the thing through which we examine. So we're talking about, is the mind material? But really, we're going to be treating this with logic and with sense perception, and these are all functions of the mind. So there's a challenge there. So there's a limitation, and in the Vedic idea, in a discussion of epistemology, some of the philosophers have said, can an eye see itself? It's a limitation of sense perception. Now, of course, you can see an eye by looking into a mirror, but that's not the same thing as directly perceiving the eye, because you're looking at a reflection of the eye. And it's just like you can't examine a microscope through itself. So we definitely can't see, hear, touch, smell, any of those physical perceptions of the mind. It exists beyond sense perception. And we can't see or touch logic either. That's like superior to sense perception as well. And it's a function of the mind itself. Now, there's a lot of things that we can't directly perceive, but we can discuss them or examine them, like gravity is an example. So we build up a picture of something like that through deduction and inference. Like even logic itself is something that's treated using logic. So when we get into a discussion about the mind, we are in somewhat of a quandary because we can't directly perceive it. So if we are going to examine it, we're going to need to do it through examining its effects and through making logical deductions and inferences about it. But it's likely that in using the instrument of logic to examine the kind of the instrument of logic itself, that we're going to run into this problem of a blind spot in that logic. If we can't see the eye directly, can we actually examine the mind itself through logic, like that level of introspection? It may be in a blind spot. So that's the first thing that I want to acknowledge, is that there is likely to be a fundamental inability to conduct this examination all the way to the bottom just by using logic or sense perception. Now, Vedic epistemology has a third arrow in its quiver, and that is what is called shabda, or like received knowledge. And in the Western kind of tradition, we have like reference or citation to previous scientific papers or examinations. And these previous studies in the Vedic tradition are they appear slightly, but they're significantly different from scientific studies in the Western tradition, in that this received wisdom in the Vedic tradition is not simply compilations of previous kind of logical examinations or empirical studies. They're actually revelations of mystical knowledge, which is supersensory and super logic. And they have two things. They have the observations and then like a methodology for experiencing those mystical states that produce it. Now, in this kind of presentation discussion here, I'm not going to attempt to prove the validity of that, rather my approach is to demonstrate its usefulness in applying it to this endeavor. It's like a similarly pragmatic approach to theories about quantum mechanics or about gravity, where you can't necessarily prove the whole thing all the way to the bottom, but it's just useful as a model to use. So that's my statement about the epistemology that I'll be using. So then the next thing that I want to do is look at what is it that we mean when we say the mind, because we need to distinguish what it is that we're actually examining here. So in the Vedic tradition, there's what's called Sankhya, which is enumeration or categorization. And in Western science, we have things like the periodic table, which is a categorization of the world into elements, the atomic theory and model, and then you've got your chemical elements in there. And by having a particular enumeration, you get access to particular technologies or effects. Like, you can't build an iPhone if your idea of the world is that it's earth, air, fire, water, ether. But once you get the atomic model and you get the periodic table, you can develop a technology out of that. So distinguishing what is meant by the mind, according to the Vedic Sankhya, the mind is an internal sense. It's the sixth sense, and it's the source of what Western psychological science calls qualia, the internal experience of sense perception. So you have the objects of sense perception in the field of perception, you have the senses themselves, then superior to the senses you have the mind, which is the internal experience of the sense perceptions themselves, and each of those is superior to the other categorically. So you can't the nose can't smell it has like a experience of smell, and then within the mind the experience of the sense perception arises. And then the mind is also the repository of faculties like memory, logic, reasoning, those kind of things. So as a software developer, it's pretty clear to me that pretty much all of the internal reasoning functions of the mind can be emulated by purely material components, software and hardware, which indicates that all of those functions of the mind are in fact purely material. And according to the Vedic Sankhya, the mind itself is actually a material phenomenon. So if we're going to look for something that's non-material, we might look to sentience as a function of the mind. So now we need to look at what do we mean by sentience. So this is where we start to get into the limitations of the reasoning faculty of the mind to examine itself. So if we define sentience as the capacity to feel, perceive, or experience subjectively, then we start to run into trouble, because we're now in the realm of subjective experience. And that's definitely vulnerable to the epistemological deficiency of trying to look at the eye with the eye, if we're going to examine sentience with itself. But if we go to the famous Turing test, which is this idea that if you have an artificial intelligence that's sufficiently advanced, a human being conversing with that artificial intelligence can't tell whether it's another sentient being or an artificial intelligence. So we kind of axiomatically accept that the human being is sentient, and then we try to develop some kind of test for sentience based on that human being. The problem with that, though, is that it doesn't tell us anything about the internal experience of the artificial intelligence, or if it even does have an internal experience. So is there a point where we get like a sufficiently sophisticated neural network that gives rise to some kind of internal experience of subjective consciousness or qualia? Or is it just like simulation all the way down? So Richard Dawkins, in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, he argues that if you get a sufficiently advanced neurological network that's capable of modeling itself, its own operation inside its simulation of the world, that's what gives rise to like consciousness, conscious experience. That was his model for how consciousness arises out of biological living entities. So in that view, mind is kind of like a self-referential, introspective neural network instantiated in a biological network in a brain, and it doesn't actually experience anything, it just thinks that it does. So the Buddhists have this kind of idea that that's what consciousness is. But according to the pure Vedic idea, there is some element which is superior to the neurological network of the brain, which can be simulated in software and hardware. And this is the experiencer of all of these things. It's the experiencer of the sense perceptions that arise from the interaction of the senses with the field of the objects and then generate some kind of sense perception within the mind. Then there's internal reasoning about that. You've got a hormonal system that generates like emotions and colors, and weights, the kind of decisioning that the mind makes. But there's something that experiences all of that and is distinct from all of it. So in support of this idea, I'd like to offer one argument from quantum mechanics, and that is that, we had this famous double slit experiment that was done back in like 1801, I think, by Thomas Young, and he was trying to determine whether light was a wave or a particle. And in that experiment, what he discovered was something that really shakes the foundation of kind of modern Western empirical science to its core, and that is that the observation of a conscious living entity interferes with the experimental results, the way that the experiment actually plays out. And when we look at that, the implications of that are that, like, without going into the whole, explaining all about the quantum mechanics, it's something that you can look into, but the implications of that are that matter, time, and space itself do not exist in any kind of concrete form until this probabilistic wave function, like it's a wave function of probabilities, is collapsed into a concrete reality, and that takes conscious observation to do it. So the implication of that is that even the emergence of atoms and molecules, which are the fundamental building blocks of this neural network that we experience as the human mind, requires conscious observation to arise out of the probability waveform. So that indicates that consciousness itself, the conscious observer, cannot be a product of the material components themselves, but it must in some sense precede them in order for them to even arise, to give rise to any kind of conscious experience of the material world, or even a material world to consciously experience. So it really turns out that all of these subatomic forces and particles don't have a concrete form unless they're under observation. So that creates a problem for a purely materialistic model of like consciousness in the self, because if the mind is a higher order emergent phenomenon from a self-referential neural network with an introspective capability, then where is the conscious observer that collapses the probabilistic wave into the concrete particles that actually make up that network? So it turns out from an examination of quantum mechanics that if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, not only does it not make a sound, but there's actually no tree, there is no woods, there are no atoms, and there is in fact no time or space itself. So I consider this, which is like on the very boundary of our current scientific understanding, to be the strongest evidence for the Vedic assertion that superior to the sense objects are the senses, superior to the senses is the mind, and superior to the mind is the self, or what is called in the Vedic Sankhya the Atma, and that the Atma is not material. So everything from the mind down belongs to the world of experience, but the Atma is non-material, it's what experiences, and it is what causes the collapse of the quantum probability wave into matter, time, and space. And David Deutsch, who's known as the father of quantum computing, in his book Fabric of Reality, he makes the case that the existence of virtual reality, that's the ability to completely simulate the universe within the universe, indicates that there's no basis for accepting the reality that we experience as special. And Elon Musk has kind of popularized this idea that we're living in a simulation. So on this basis, and from the behavior of matter, time, and space at the quantum level, it seems to me that an argument for the waveform collapsing entity being material is difficult to make. It suffers from the epistemological shortcomings that I began with, and I don't see how it can account for waveform collapse using something that is itself a product of waveform collapse. So the universe requires a non-waveform collapsed component to even come into existence, and it literally does exist only as the world of experience. And that requires a non-material component to generate out of the probabilistic waveform. So on that basis, I say that something that we might call mind, which is the experiencing conscious entity, is non-material.